Okay, hello, welcome back to another tutorial on the Singapore Cambridge English Literature exam. Okay, the last tutorial I think I mentioned the idea that for each part of literature that you will be looking at in your exam, for example, poetry, prose, passages of prose, essays and drama, you can employ a toolkit which helps in your analysis of that particular piece of literature. I gave the analogy of using a car, the engine, the interior and the body of a car, to understand why a car overall is very attractive. Similarly, we can use the toolkit to understand why literature is attractive. Okay, so let's try and think about that in a bit more detail. If we look at poetry to start with, for example, I used the acronym WITSB, which is spelled out here. Now, what do each of those letters mean? Well, W is for words, I is for imagery, T is for tone, T is for theme, S is for structure, and P is for poetic devices. And what I encourage you to do is to use this acronym in the order that it's presented. So first you will look at words, then you will look at the imagery in the poem, then you will consider the tone, then the theme, then the structure, and lastly the poetic devices that the poet has used. Doing so should allow you to build up a much better understanding of the poem as you read through it. When you first read a poem, it may be quite elusive. What it's about, what you can understand from the poem can be quite tough. But if you take this toolkit to the poem and consider all these different parts, these 6 different parts, you should find that your understanding grows as you go through the process. So when I say words, I'm also including the title in this, so all the words, title there. So it includes the title. So what we're really trying to pick up when we use that first toolkit is the poet has used specific words in the poem. Every word has been chosen carefully, and if we can consider those words that he's used, we can start to understand more and more what the poem is about. Similarly, the imagery that the poet has used in the poem can help us to understand what the poem is trying to tell us. The tone of the poem. And again, I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail or try and apply it to a poem today. This is just to introduce you to the toolkit that we're using for poetry for this part of the literature exam. So T is for tone, the sort of the general tone of the poem. Is it a joyous poem? Is it a happy poem? Is it a sad poem? Is it mysterious? Is it dark? Is it brooding? Is it disturbing? You can get a general idea of the tone of the poem from the words and the imagery that's being used, and then leading on from that, you can get an idea of the theme of the poem. Is it about death? Is it about being reborn? Is it about a celebration of life in some respect? So you can probably pick out 1 or 2 of the key themes of the poem by doing parts 1, 2, and 3 first. The structure of the poem should complement those words, imagery, tone, and theme in terms of the length of the sentence, the punctuation through the poem, how the poet has intentionally used certain structures available to the poet in order to help convey the message or the feeling or the emotion of the poem that the poet's looking for. And then finally, the other poetic devices that the poet has also used. The similes, the metaphors, and so on and so on. So this is the first toolkit, WITSB. So this is what I would like to encourage you to use whenever you are looking at analysing a piece of poetry in your English literature, whether it's in school or whether it's for the exam. And we're going to do more of this for practice in future tutorials. So that's the first toolkit for poetry, Whitby. Okay, so when we are looking at analysing a passage of prose, up here, the toolkit that I would like you to use is the range of narrative techniques, or what they might call literary devices. This sometimes gets a bit confusing, but narrative technique or literary devices, I think, encompass a lot of different things, and I think the key ones are these. So under narrative techniques or literary devices, we are going to group them according to style, characters, settings, plot, and lastly theme. Okay, now under each of these subheadings there comes a number of other things. So let's just quickly run through them. And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail because we'll have lots of practice of these when we start to analyse passages of prose. But just to go through them briefly at the moment. Okay, so the narrative technique of style will include things like figurative language, so your metaphors, your similes, your personification, hyperbole, alliteration, assonance, and so on and so on. What the passage of prose demonstrates in terms of those things. Next, we can think about the imagery which is used in the passage of prose. Imagery is to do with the senses, so all of those things which refer to your sense of what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you touch, so the senses. That is in slight contrast to symbolism. So symbolism is what something stands for. It's not literal. So imagery and symbolism are quite different in those cases. If the imagery is not something which encourages the senses, then you can describe it as graphic description. So when the author of the passage that you're looking at is using very vivid or powerful words, described certain situations, but it isn't appealing to any of your senses, then you can say it's graphic description instead. If you look at the words in isolation or the groups of words, we can refer to the diction. So how the author uses specially carefully chosen words in terms of diction to create an effect or an impact. All of those things come together to influence mood and atmosphere in the passage of prose, something that the author has intentionally done. And then finally, under the narrative technique of style, we have the irony, empathy, or sympathy. So this is the tool that the author is using to make us feel something. So those are all the different parts of style under the narrative technique. When it comes to characters, what we're looking at is several things. We're looking at the action, what the characters actually do in the passage that you're analysing. We're looking at what they may say in the passage that you're analysing. And we may also look at how the character responds, or how the reader responds to what the character is doing or saying in the passage that you're analysing. So those are all under the general subheading of characters. Okay, the next heading is settings. So in this sense, we're analysing the location or the place of the passage of prose. And what we're really looking at there is to see how the setting of that particular passage is influencing what's going on and how you react and feel about it as a reader. So you're gaining meaning from the setting. The last couple, plot is how the author uses any of these particular techniques. Backstory, flashback, foreshadow, rising action, falling action, climaxes or endings or cliffhangers, and so on and so on. So the use of plot as a narrative technique to create an impact or an effect in the passage that you're reading. And then lastly, theme. Theme can be, good versus evil, human versus nature, and so on and so on. So the way the author has used a particular theme in the passage that you're reading. So again, to summarize, all of these are the tools which you would use under the general toolkit that we call narrative technique in order to analyze and break down and then answer any question on a passage of prose. Typically that's something you've taken from the set text that your school has set for you, or if not, an unseen text that you might get in one of the exam papers. Okay, so that is the toolkit for a passage of prose. Right, we're going to next look at the toolkit for writing essays, and I'll come back in just a second with a new screen. Okay, so the last toolkit that we're going to look at is the toolkit that you would use when you are answering exam questions on essays. And this is when the examiner is asking you to write an essay on probably your set text, and you have to write 1 or 2 pages. Okay, the toolkit that we're going to use when we're talking about essay questions is what I call CRUST, the acronym CRUST. What do each of those letters mean? C is for the characters, R is for the relationships, U is for understanding, S is for symbolism, and T is for theme. Now, when you come to write essay questions, you're typically going to have to write an essay on something along the lines of these 4 different areas. So, the examiner might ask you to explore the themes that are being used in the set text. You might have to look at some of the symbolism which is used in the text, if there are some. You may have to look at the relationships between the characters in the book, or between the character and something else, like his pet dog, or his environment, or his house, or his past, or something like that. So relationships can be an essay question. And more popular are questions on the characters in the book, and you have to answer questions on the characters. Okay, so the U that I've put in this acronym is for understanding, and that's because there's no substitute for really reading the set text, really knowing the story, really analyzing and understanding the characters, the relationships, the themes that are going on, and putting a lot of effort into, really digging into the story and all of what's going on, so that you have a really good understanding of the story. You can only answer the essay questions on the characters, relationships and themes and so on if you have a good understanding of the text itself, which is why your schools go to a lot of trouble to help you analyze and understand it. Okay, so that's the toolkit that I would suggest we use to analyze the essay questions and to attempt to answer the essay questions. And again, we're going to have more practice of these in the future when we go through some of the essay questions and see how we can answer them. Okay, that's all for today, and we'll come back with more later. Thank you.